God's been stirring in my heart since about October of 2017 about surrender. And then when Pastor Lynn told us that this year, when the calendar flipped and it became 2018, and he said, this is the year of freedom. And he's been teaching about freedom. And if you have missed any of his message on fear-free, come on, somebody. You need to get it. And I told him I'm going to steal all his notes. And Austin and I are going to publish a book called Fear-Free, and we're going to take credit because I can't get that boy to write a book. But it just such amazing atmosphere and stuff that he's been sharing. You need to have it in your spirit. But today we're going to talk a little bit about surrender. Such a fun word, surrender. Doesn't that just sound like fun? Do you want to surrender something? It's kind of like, hey, do you ever wake up in the morning like, I think I'll just surrender something today? You know, that just never comes out of maybe your money to Starbucks or I don't know, but outside of that, sometimes that doesn't sound like a very fun word. I really am trying to turn. I need those little tabs on my Bible. Okay. But I want you to turn quickly to Romans chapter 12. And I'm just kind of going to kick off with this. Yesterday we had a discovery seminar. It was awesome. How many of you, I know we had kind of an intimate group. Who all was at Discovery yesterday? Give me a shout. That was so fun. We talked. If you've never been to a Discovery seminar, it's a one-day seminar we do about the motivational and spiritual gifts, and also just about your God-given identity and personality. And it's just so much fun. We had a good time. I played a Jenga game yesterday. That was pretty intense. I'm just going to tell you. It was awesome. Thank you to everyone who played and taught me to play. And so it was good. I was like making up rules. They're like, Leanne was like, those are not the rules. And I was like, oh, okay. So Romans chapter 12. Did we say happy birthday to Bob? Oh, we did in the first service. Today is Bob's 84th birthday. Stand up, Bob. I'm going to look as good as you when I'm 84 and have as much energy and life. He just like is full of life. You would never know he's 84 ever. It's okay that I tell your age, right? Okay, that's good. Because I already told it like 3 times. You got to know that, my legacy of my mother and my grandmother goes a long way because my grandmother eloped when she was 90 and went and got married. Well, that's why when people say, I just don't know if I can take the risk, I'm like, come on. Yeah, so anyway, she's outlived a couple husbands. She's 97, almost 98, lives by herself, drives her own car, will tell you the way it is any day of the week, and will pray over you till the day is long. And she's amazing. That's not what my message is about. Okay, Romans chapter 12. Verse 1, therefore I urge you, that means this is something important. I'm pushing you, brothers, in the view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, for this is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. Somebody shout, transformed. By the renewing of your mind. And then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So in this scripture, when we talk about surrender, surrender requires change. And like I was saying a minute ago, then when Pastor Lynn declared this as the year of freedom, God began to talk to me about, he said, Angela, on the other side of surrender is where freedom comes from. So like when he's been sharing about things that we need to be free of fears and bondages and things that try to weigh us down in our life and keep us back and push us back and keep us afraid, it usually requires us to surrender something. Now, when God started talking to me about this, I was like, I'm sure he's talking about things. Like he's going to make me surrender stuff, like money or shoes, or I don't know, I'm just listing things that are valuable to me. But, he's going to require me to do that. And he's like, no, I'm getting ready to tell you, I'm going to make you surrender people. And I'm like, what are you about to do, God? So I get all kind of nervous and a little shaky inside. God's like, don't be nervous, because when you give people and relationships and things to me, then my perfect will can happen. But when you control it and you think you can transform it, then all of a sudden, it just doesn't go exactly the way that God planned. It might go the way you planned, which usually is not always the right direction, right? So surrender requires change. Surrender requires transformation. There's something that has to change on the inside of us, and it starts with a choice. Have you ever been, how many of you have ever flown on an airplane? So if you've never flown, I've flown with some people, like we went to South Africa, and a couple of the girls that went that had never flown, like on a plane, and we got on a flight for 16 hours, y'all. It's a little scary that a plane can stay in the air that long without refueling or stopping or landing, and it's just amazing to me. But when I get in an airplane and I sit down in that seat and they tell you to buckle your little seatbelt, which really isn't going to do anything. But my goodness, you better follow that flight attendant, because she will come by there. She will let you have it. Put your seat back up. Buckle that seatbelt. But when you sit down on a plane and all of a sudden you get on that runway and you start going up, 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 and those wheels leave the ground and those wheels go up inside that plane, I am fully surrendered to that pilot in that airplane. I don't even know him. I don't know those pilots. I pray to God they are fully surrendered to the operations of that airplane. But I don't have a choice. There's absolutely nothing I can do about it. I don't know how to fly a plane. I can't take over if something goes wrong. If an engine goes out and this engine goes out and we start going down, there's not one thing I can do about it. I am surrendered to that place. So when you're surrendered to something, it's out of your control. It's quiet in here. It's out of your control. And there are things that we will trust in our lives more than Jesus. We will surrender to a pilot more than we will surrender to Jesus, and you don't even know them. So not too long ago, Tim had a knee surgery. I shared about it. How many weeks ago now? 4 weeks? 5 weeks? 6 weeks? 7 weeks? Just seems like a long time you're still hobbling. I don't know. I'm just trying to get... Let me tell you something. Exercise is bad. I do not feel like you need to surrender to exercise, because then you have to surrender to surgery. And I just feel like that's just not godly. But that's just my humble opinion. You should do whatever God tells you to do. But I've only had 3 surgeries in my life. So 2 of them were foot surgeries, and then one I had a C-section with Sophia, which I was actually awake during that surgery. So the other 2 required anesthesia. Right? So when you go in, how many of you have had a surgery of any kind? You are surrendered to that doctor, to that surgeon, to that staff of amazing personnel and nurses and people in that operating room. You don't get to go in and say, let me tell you what to do with that scalpel right there. That probably would not go well for you unless you are a surgeon, right? So I went in to have my first foot surgery. They were voluntary surgeries because I don't wear good shoes. Let me rephrase. I do wear good shoes. They are not good for my feet. So, and as you can see, if you don't ever see me in worship, I'm in good shoes and I'm jumping and kicking and all sorts of mess. Terrible for your feet. But I believe that Jesus is okay with it. So anyway, so I went and did this surgery, and they had to fix it. So the doctor came out at the end of the surgery, and Tim and my family were in the waiting room. And, he comes out to tell how everything went. And he's like, everything went well, but we had a little problem in the operating room. And Tim's like, oh, what happened? Well, he's like, we put her under the first dose of anesthesia, which is normally plenty of anesthesia because it's not a long surgery. But she was continuing to shout orders to me and everyone in the operating room in my subconscious state. So if you think you're a control freak, When I am under anesthesia, I'm still trying to tell people what to do. And y'all should pray for Tim more. And so the doctor said, so I had to look at the anesthesiologist and say, put her all the way down. Like, just like that. Just put her all the way down. So when Tim and I get in intense, godly discussions around things, he'll be like, don't make me put you all the way down. And I'll be like, oh my heavens. But how many of you know, even in that moment, that was irritating the doctor, but I still had no control. No matter what I was shouting out of my mouth to them, they did not care, because they still were going to do what they were going to do, right? I was fully surrendered, and they didn't want to hear me not be surrendered, so they just put me all the way down. But there are situations, there are things in our life that require an act of surrender, that we have to give up control and allow God to take control with his full will. See, you and I have this thing called will, and he won't make you do anything. He won't make you surrender. God did not even make Jesus surrender to go to the cross. Jesus chose to surrender it all for you and I. So it requires a choice, right? Turn with me to John chapter 12, and this is kind of the story I want to talk about today. Very familiar story. And I said to the first service, I hope and pray I can articulate what I feel in my spirit and the way God said it to me. I hope I can say it to you like that in the next few minutes. Because if I can, I believe it could be life-changing for you. Have you ever had one of those moments, like with a parent or a grandparent or somebody in your life, kind of have this just real serious talk moment? Like they're like, come on, I want you to sit down. Now we're going to talk about this thing that's going on. And it gets real serious. That's kind of what God did with me about one this morning. And I was just kind of like, oh, okay. So I'm asking God, help me get out of the way, God, so you can say what you want to say. Total surrender. You know, we hold on to the things that we find valuable. The things that we want to control are the things that we think are valuable, like my life when I was under anesthesia. That's valuable to me. My children, the reason why with Jasmine or Sophia I am like helicopter mommy off the chart is because they are worth so much to me. So I try to control everything around them sometimes to a fault because they're worth so much. And when we talk about surrender, you will only have life change when you surrender to something that has worth to you. I need y'all to talk back to me just a little bit. They're going to have to help me preach this just a little bit. Y'all are the caffeinated crowd. You can do it. Come on. True surrender is when you find something worth surrendering for. And I believe when we talk about Jesus, we don't surrender for him, we surrender to him. Worth will drive your surrender. Let's look at John chapter 12. And like I said, this is a story probably, if you've ever been to church, you've probably heard it at some point or another, or you've read it. And I want to talk about two very significant people in this story. One who surrendered to Jesus and one who surrendered to betrayal. And leading up to this moment, let me just give you a quick picture leading up to John 12:1. So just before this was when Jesus had gone to the town of Bethany and he had gone and raised Lazarus from the dead. Right? So how many of you remember that story? So Jesus showed up, Mary and Martha, true great sisters. They're in a lot of stories with Jesus. And they had sent word to Jesus that Lazarus was sick. and that Jesus needed to get there so he could get healed. They knew he was the only one that could do anything about Lazarus and for Lazarus. And so Jesus kind of took his sweet time and told his disciples, he's just asleep, don't worry about it. They didn't realize what was really going on. So they get there, and now Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. Martha is ticked. She is mad. She did not even get up and go meet Jesus. Jesus had to go where she was. And she walks up, and Martha's like, you are too late. If you would have been here. And Jesus is just looking at her, and so she goes and gets her sister Mary, who's still in the house, and said, Jesus is here. So maybe Martha's thinking, maybe Jesus is going to do something. And sure enough, Jesus has a moment with Mary. She runs out, falls at Jesus' feet, and says, Jesus, if you'd only been here. And in that moment, Jesus says, there's one of the most famous moments in the Bible in John 11:35, the shortest verse in the Bible, which says, Jesus wept. There was one person in the Bible who moved Jesus' heart to that place. And that was Mary. Because there was something in her heart that was so surrendered to Jesus. There was something in her that was like, I think you may be too late, but you're worth more to me than anything, so if anybody can do it, it's you. But something inside of Mary moved Jesus. It wasn't just her request to raise Lazarus from the dead. It wasn't her request to do something. It wasn't that she was upset that she felt like Jesus was too late. It was something inside of Mary's heart that so shifted something on the inside of Jesus. So right after all that happened, he ends up raising Lazarus from the dead. It's this huge miracle that happens. It was that miracle that caused them, the high priest, to send people out to go arrest Jesus. This was the last big miracle that caused a big uproar, that put the things in motion to send Jesus to the cross. So that's what just happened. And now he's coming back to Bethany because Mary and Martha and Lazarus and his disciples, they've decided that was so cool that Jesus came and raised Lazarus and he's hanging out. We'll just have a dinner for Jesus and thank him for being such a great Savior of the earth. So we're going to have dinner. So that's where we are in John chapter 12. Now this story is in 3 of the Gospels, and I'm going to use the one in John. Verse 1, 6 days before the Passover. Now, we just celebrated Easter last Sunday. So put this in a time perspective. This was 6 days before Jesus was going to the cross. This big dinner was happening. The next day, he was going to ride the donkey in and have all the triumphal entry and all that stuff. The next day, a few hours from this moment. So 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. I love that everywhere you see Lazarus' name at this point, it's comma, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Because from that point on, you only knew Lazarus by the miracle in his life, not just by who he was. Verse 2, here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, as usual, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with Jesus. So I see this picture of all these people hanging out, people kicked back at the table, waiting on a woman to bring them food. Waiting on somebody to bring them food. That's our house, right? No, just kidding. But I see this picture of a very relaxed, celebratory, friends moment. Nobody really understanding that in 6 days, Jesus would not be there any longer. That time was short. But there was something inside of Mary that she knew something. There was something going on. And so they're in the middle of this dinner, hanging out. And in verse 3, here comes Mary. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. Somebody say expensive. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. If I could title this message, anything that I could tell you what I felt in my spirit when I read that, it would be called The Scent of Surrender. Because in that moment when she broke that, it didn't just fill the room, it didn't just fill that particular area, it filled the whole house. The aroma and the fragrance of what she broke. And it says it was expensive. And we think about that. We're like, yeah, they said it was a year's wages. It's like 300 pieces of silver back then. And so I decided to see what that really was. So I go to Google, like you should, to find out all things. And if we did it, the calculations today, and took minimum wage, $8.75-ish something an hour, and we multiply that by a 10-hour day, 12-hour day, and we put that for a whole year's wages, it would be almost $30,000, which is not a big salary, actually. But in that day, I mean, that's a pretty good amount of money. And it's not a big deal to give something when you don't have a lot. You're like, well, no, it's really not. It's kind of like, I ain't got nothing anyway. Here you go. But when you have something that's valuable, when you've saved up money, when you've saved up something for something, and then God's like, that's what I want you to give. We would term that a sacrifice. But I don't believe in this situation that Mary felt like that was a sacrifice at all. Because when your heart is surrendered, no matter what you give and no matter what it's worth, it's not really a sacrifice because you're already fully surrendered. Do you see the difference of what I'm telling you? It's not just something she gave. It's not about the expense of the perfume, although that's great. And this particular perfume was actually the oil and perfume they used for funerals. That's what that was. So I don't know if she already had it, if somebody gave it to him, if it was supposed to be for Lazarus. I don't know. All I know is she decided there is something in this room that is worth way more than what's in this jar. And we have a little bit of an advantage because we actually know that Jesus went to the cross. Those people sitting in that room didn't even know what was about to happen. They didn't even understand the act of surrender that he was about to die in 6 days. But there was something in Mary that rose up in her out of a place of surrender in her life that broke something in that atmosphere. And it was something that completely didn't make sense at all. I mean, obviously she loved Jesus. She was probably super grateful that he had raised Lazarus from the dead, her brother. But it was something bigger than that. There was a worth of who Jesus was to her that was bigger than all of that. And it made no sense at all. I think about how we would react in that situation. I thought about how I would react. And for me, I probably, which we're going to get to, would have sided a little bit with Judas in this moment. You're like, wow, Angela, you want to be like Judas? No, I don't want to. But there's something in me that would have been like, we seriously could have used that for so many better things. It's kind of like when we sit in a finance team meeting, and Tim said earlier, where does the money go when we're taking tithes? And, you know, when we're sitting there and we're doing our best to be good stewards over things in the house. And sometimes it's just like, we better hear Jesus. We better hear Jesus. We better not make decisions out of our own selfish opinions. But we tend to go that way. But it didn't make any sense. I mean, we come in church, in our church this morning. I mean, if somebody had never been in Jubilee, never been to a church like this before, like kind of like when I met Tim, his parents were kind of Catholic. He was really heathen. And so the first time I brought him to Jubilee, I mean, he was like, you know. And so I know people who come in and it's like, why do they raise their hands? Why is everybody in here? Why is that girl jumping in those shoes like that? It's going to hurt her feet. She shouldn't do that. Why is that happening? You know, do they have a gun to your back or what's happening? You know, but there's something that we do things sometimes from the smallest thing to the biggest thing that doesn't make sense. Why are there dancers across the front? Why are people, you know, jumping up and down, running around, dancing? Sometimes things don't make sense. But when there is a place in your life that has been surrendered, that you just can't help yourself. I want to live in that place. I don't want to visit it. It didn't make sense. She surrendered her reputation. She was in the middle of this room. Probably it was all guys, and women probably weren't supposed to be in there. Her hair wasn't supposed to be down. I mean, you can read all the history of all of that. Pretty much every rule, she pretty much broke it. She broke the rules. She broke the jar. She just broke it all. It's true surrender. You don't care what anybody thinks when you finally get to that place. Her act of surrender was so much bigger than perfume. It literally changed the atmosphere, and it revealed what was about to come ahead. And nobody in that room mattered except Jesus. And let me say this. It doesn't say it in John, but in Mark and in Matthew it says this. It says, truly I tell you, this was Jesus at the end of all this. He said, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. And guess what? Today, we're talking about Mary and what she did. So that was true. For all the rest of eternity, people will talk about this moment. They won't talk about what Judas did in that moment. They're not going to talk about what Martha served for dinner that night. They're not going to talk even about what Jesus said. They are going to talk about what Mary did in this moment. A surrendered place in your life will bring something eternal. It can bring something eternal. So there's other people at the table. And let me pick up in verse 4. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Surprise, surprise. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Now, Jesus immediately replied and said, leave her alone. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But can we just talk for a moment about Judas, about what was going on in this moment? Because I really had to think through what had happened, because I'm thinking Judas was one of the 12. Judas was a disciple. He was like on the team. Like he was in the inner circle. He walked with Jesus for 3 years. He was one of the ones when Jesus came walking by, he's like, hey, come follow me. He's like, all right, just drop your stuff and go. You know, no hesitation. Jesus picked him. Jesus picked him as one of the 12, just like Peter. Just like John, just like all the other disciples. He got to see every miracle. He got to see every situation. He got to see Jesus in his rawness. He got to spend time praying with Jesus. He got to walk with him, talk with him. He got discipled by him. He got poured into by him. But at some point, his affections for Jesus were not worth enough. And something else became more valuable than Jesus. And now, all of a sudden, instead of the surrendered heart towards who Jesus was, and all the disciples sitting around looking at him saying, tell us everything. We want everything. We want to be everything that you are. Pour it into us. All of a sudden, there was something about Jesus that just wasn't worth it. And that is the place where you begin to surrender your heart to other things that you think are valuable, but they are temporary. And I was like, but Jesus, I don't understand. And God said, here's the thing, Ann. She said, Judas was committed. He was not surrendered. And I'm going to tell you this. It took me just a minute. I had to take a minute. I'm like, what? And Jesus was like, no, he was committed. He wasn't surrendered. He followed me. He made the commitment. He did all the things that he was supposed to do. And on the outside, you would have thought Judas was all in. But surrender is not an outward thing. Surrender is an inward act. I told y'all I tried to ask God to let me lighten up, but he just wouldn't. And I was just like, God, I don't want to be committed. I want to be surrendered. What if we walked in to every relationship in our life that we know is from God and we said it like that? What if we said, you know what? Here's the thing. Tim is my husband. There's nothing I wouldn't do for him. I love him, but I love Jesus more. That doesn't offend my husband because this relationship makes this covenant happen. And if I can't be surrendered here, why in the world would I ever want to stick it out and be surrendered here? That's where we miss it. Because our affections begin to become something that we put our affections on something that we value more than him. I hope y'all are getting this. I'm going to go one step further because this is the way God said it to me. Can I say it how he said it to me? He said it's suicidal when our affections don't match the worth of Jesus. Because Judas, when he made that shift, listen, he didn't care that was worth $30,000. He went and sold Jesus for $1,000 5 days later. It wasn't about the money. It was about something selfish on the inside of him. And I mean, obviously, I believe it was demonic, but we let those doors open in our lives by surrendering to this thing instead of here. And I was like, that will be suicidal to my destiny. If I don't get to a place where I'm like, when my affections for a relationship, for people, for happiness, for selfish gain, for things that I think are going to make me feel good, for comfort, for whatever it is, I am setting myself up to be a suicide of my destiny. If you think about surrender like that, that should scare the daylights out of you. It does out of me because there's such bigger purpose and we live in these little bubbles. Like we're just like go through life in these little tunnels, like everything is magnified around all the drama around our lives. You hear me say it all the time. The smaller your world, the bigger your drama. But it's the truth. That was Judas' world. His world got smaller and smaller. And all of a sudden it became all about him and all about getting something for himself. He was tired of Jesus getting the glory. I don't know. I'm not in Judas's head. But something came on him that caused him to surrender to an act of betrayal instead of surrendering to the one he had followed for 3 years. And I told you in the beginning of this message, God was like, Ange, you're going to have to surrender people. And if you know me at all, I have a very hard time of letting go of people. Like when people are like, I've decided to move somewhere, I like go and like hyperventilate. I'm like, no, you can't leave. You know, I don't like people to leave because I love very deeply. And I value people. And so there's something about that, but there comes a moment where it's like, if you're just committed and you're not surrendered, I need to let you go. Think about your life and your relationships. We can just talk about me. It's easier. What does your surrender smell like? Mary's heart of surrender brought that fragrance in the house. The perfume was symbolic of the fragrance of the surrender of her heart. So let's talk quickly how Jesus responded in verse 7, and then we're going to wrap this up in a couple minutes. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. Now, Jesus says three things. First of all, I think he was really ticked at Judas. Now, he had the moment, right? He knew what was going to happen. He already knew Judas was going to betray him. He already knew what was in his heart. He could have called him out right there in that moment. But Mary's act of surrender was more valuable and was more important to Jesus in that moment than calling Judas out. Because he knew that what Judas was spitting out of his mouth could poison that surrendered heart that was on the inside of Mary. And Jesus was not going to let that happen because her heart of surrender was more valuable to him than Judas betraying him. That's why a surrendered heart is so powerful. And he said, listen, three things, and I'm going to say them kind of backwards. He said, you won't always have me. You won't always have me. That's why the presence of God is so valuable. I could just see Jesus. I could feel Jesus' heartbeat. About 2 this morning, I'm thinking Jesus is looking at him saying, Judas, seriously, this is about me. This is not about you. This is not about everything else. You are missing the point. I am only going to be on this earth a few more days. You're missing it. And then he said, the poor you're going to have with you always, which revealed his real motive. That it really wasn't about the poor. It wasn't about giving to them. It was for his own gain. But the one that got me the most was when he said, she can keep this for the day of my burial. So I didn't fully understand that. You can go look up all the Bible commentary and all the stuff about it, or Pastor Len will be back and he will tell you every detail that you want to know because he's brilliant. But for me, I was just like, God, what does that mean? And I couldn't figure it out because she had already dumped all the oil out, the perfume. It wasn't like she was getting to keep some of that oil or some of that perfume for his burial. She had already broken it. It was already all spilled out. So I was like, what does she get to keep for his burial? And that's when God said to me, it was the heart of surrender that was on the inside of her. And then I realized why she wasn't one of the Marys who was at the tomb. There were 2 Marys who showed up at the tomb, Mary Magdalene and another Mary, mother of somebody, I don't know. They were all Marys. That's all you need to know. But and I was like, it's always this question, was Mary the sister of Martha and the sister of Lazarus, was she at the tomb the morning that Jesus raised from the dead when he showed himself to them? She wasn't there. Do you know why? Because she already knew he was going to resurrect. That heart of surrender in her, that moment where she broke that thing, she had already said, hey, this is for your burial, but I know you're not going to stay there. That was already in her. Do you understand that there are surrendered places in your life and in my life that if you will really surrender, he will resurrect that dead thing on the other side of that? When I got this about her, I was like, oh my goodness. She didn't have to have some false hope. When she watched Jesus be crucified on that, she had already seen him raise the dead. She didn't doubt that. in that moment when she fell at the feet of Jesus and said, "You're too late. If you'd only been here." And Jesus looked at her, and tears welled up in his eyes and began to roll down his cheeks. And if you look at the meaning, it's actually a really soft, gentle cry at that moment, because he was moved by her heart. And in that moment, when she looked in the eyes of Jesus and she saw what was about to happen, that surrender moment happened for her. And then Lazarus was raised from the dead. So she had no doubt that Jesus was going to resurrect. That's what she got to keep. Her act of surrender, that act of worship she did at his feet, was to say, "Listen, I'm going to go ahead and do this now because I already know I don't have to show up to the tomb. I'm going to do it while you're alive because you're going to stay alive." Man, that should stir y'all up after Easter was just last week. My God. Mary gave it all. Jesus betrayed it all. When you run, when you resist, when you let other people and circumstances win in your life, you are not surrendered. The word win and the word resist are antonyms of the word surrender. If you surrender, you assume you don't win. But actually, when you get on the other side of surrender, you win forever. You don't just win temporarily. Let's end with this. I told you I was going to stop. I'm going to end with this scripture, Matthew 26. In verse 39, "Are you Mary or are you Judas?" Well, that's not a very nice question, Angela. I told the first service, y'all can be Mary. Just choose. You don't have to be Judas. That's up to you. I know I can't even lighten it up when we're talking about this. It's impossible. It's so real and so intense and so life-changing if you can get it. Matthew 26 and verse 39. So this was when Jesus was headed to the Garden of Gethsemane. Yeah, 26:39, sorry. I'm going to start in verse 36. "Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' And he took Peter and the sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me.' Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed." That so overwhelmed me, he never even made it to the place. He was so overwhelmed with making a decision of surrender in this moment. God didn't make him do it. The Father did not make him die for you. Jesus chose to die for you. He chose it. He picked you. He chose it. He chose you. He chose to suffer. He chose to go through that. He chose to take every single sin we would ever face on himself. I don't even know how he carried the weight of that in this moment. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." The Message version says, "But please, not what I want. You, Father, what do you want?" There comes a moment when we talk about surrender, and I love that God is gracious because he allows us to surrender in parts, in layers. He loves us. He's not like, just you have to surrender it all right now or nothing. It's kind of that concept of, I really want this right now. We're surrendering the baby in the center aisle. I really want this right now. I really want this from you right now, right now, Angela. I really want this. And I'm kind of like, oh. And he's like, no, come on. Let me have it. Come on. Surrender it to me. And I'm like, okay. Whew. This is awesome. And then I kind of live in that zone. And then he's like, okay, now I want that. And you're like, oh, but I thought you were going to let me keep that one. And he's like, well, I did for a little bit. But now you're at a place you got to let that go too. So come on, let me have it. Let me have it. It's like getting the candy from the baby. Let me have it. You know, and it's like, because we want to control it. I think this candy is more valuable than what you're going to do for me. I think it is. I think this relationship is more valuable because they make me feel really good and they make me feel accepted and they make me feel affirmed. Oh, sorry, we'll go back to candy. Okay. I'll quit having sex outside of marriage. Okay. God is so gracious that he lets us surrender in layers, but it starts with your will. And that's why in the very beginning when we read about in Romans, transformation comes by knowing the perfect will of God. Not my will, but your will. Not my will, but your will. Doesn't mean we're not going to make decisions and make mistakes. God is the God of second, third, fifth, 10th, 100th chances. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we do right or wrong. That's not what's important to God. It's where's your heart in that process. Mary was not perfect. It even says in a couple things she made some sinful decisions in her life, and I'm sure she had to ask forgiveness over and over. It's not about that. It's about saying, you will always be first, Jesus. You will always be worth more than that. I might have chosen that for the moment, but you will always be worth more than that. Come on, just stand up with me. Thank you for enduring, I think, a very serious message today. And I think surrender is an act of, it's not something that I can make you do, that somebody else can make you do, that even God can make you do. It is a choice between you and him. Mary walked in that room, broke that jar. It didn't matter who else was there. It didn't matter what else was happening. It didn't matter what rules she was breaking. She just had to demonstrate that she was willing to give it all. And that's all that God is asking. And I hear Jesus asking that question today. Do you want your will or do you want my will? Whatever the thing right now that is taking over your thoughts, that is taking over your heart, that is taking over your spirit, that is consuming you right now in this moment, that you keep thinking about, that you have a picture about, whatever that is, that's probably the thing he wants. But it's up to you. You can hold on to it, or you can say, Jesus, you got to help me, but I want to give it to you. You can't do it on your own. But I hear him asking, do you want what I want, or do you want what you want? Do you want my perfect will, or do you want to keep doing it your way? So if that's you this morning, I would just walk down here just like Mary did in that room. She walked right up in that room. It didn't matter who was in there, who was sitting around at the table with their feet propped up. She walked right in, threw herself down at the feet of Jesus and said, it's all about you right now. I can't do this anymore. I can't carry this anymore. I'm not going to hold on to what I think is more valuable than you anymore. I'm not going to keep doing this stuff anymore. I got to let you have this, and you're going to help me, Jesus. Come on, there is something in this room. I cannot express to you the value and what life-changing things could happen out of your life in a moment like this. Can Jesus really do that much in a moment? Yes, he can. And he will. Jesus. Come on, if you came up to the front, you just need to start telling him what you're surrendering. Just tell him. Tell him. Jesus, this has been more valuable than you, but not anymore. He might even let you keep it if he's just more valuable. He's just got to be first today. It's an act of surrender. It's an act of surrender. You got to have this moment. We're going to come pray for you and the prayer team can come. But I'm telling you, you got to have this moment. It's you and Jesus. He's not too late. He is not too late. There are things that he's going to resurrect on the inside of some of you in this room. And out of a surrendered heart, you will see the resurrection in your life. Oh, Jesus. Come on, get your moment. Mary had her moment. Get your moment. Don't be dignified. Don't make it all pretty. Make it your moment.
Every part of my world, take this time to breathe on this heart that is now yours. Ooh, you can have it all. You can have it all. Every part of my world, take this life and breathe on this heart that is now yours. You can have it all. Every part of my world, take this life and breathe on this heart that is now yours. I surrender all. I surrender all to you, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. I surrender. I surrender all to thee, blessed Savior. I surrender. Oh, I surrender all. I surrender all to thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender. You can have it all. Every part of my world, take this life and breathe on this heart that is now. You can have it all. Every part of my world, take this life and breathe on this heart